Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Jana Puglierin.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. It's a European election bonanza. Today we will breeze through a flurry of European elections, most notably the Romanian presidential election, but also Poland had an election, as did Portugal. And then we'll talk about the UKEU summit and the results of that. Then we're going to turn to a conversation with Jana Puglierin, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and head of its Berlin office, to discuss the priorities of the new German government. We hope you enjoy the show. All right, Donetienne, let's talk Eurovision. Actually, we're not going to talk Eurovision because that's the one big pan-European thing that I just have never really gotten into. I know everyone is obsessed with it. It was quite controversial. If you want to listen to podcasts on that, I'm sure there are many that are doing it. But
we can just say Austria won. Congratulations to them.
Congratulations.
For this interesting opera techno act. And they will be hosting next year.
Yeah. Is that what happens?
Yes. When you win, you host.
Okay. Literally no idea. I've just seen the movie and I thought the movie was ridiculous. And then I watched the real thing. And then I was like,
far.
Well, when I say I watched the real thing, I watched like 20 minutes. I was like, oh my God, the movie
actually,
is more tame.
Iceland's thing was pretty close to the acts that you see in the movie.
Yeah. So that's not an endorsement of the movie. It's not an endorsement of Eurovision.
It's a fun movie.
But the big news, I think, this weekend was Romanian presidential election. Romania had its second round vote. And over the last 2 weeks, there had been a degree of panic, I think you can say, in Brussels and many hearts of Europhiles around the world that, there was going to be a far-right candidate that was going to win this election, create some sort of far-right alliance with Viktor Orban and bring the European project to its knees, and that the European Union was doomed. And that's not what happened, was it?
No, it's not. There was definitely deep concern in Brussels for this, but it's not what happened. So the center candidate, moderate mayor of Bucharest, Nicu Jordan, who's in the Union to Save Romania party, won pretty decisively, I should say, close to 54%, and his opponent got closer to 46%. So that's a big sigh of relief, I think, in most places in Europe, but also in most places in Romania. We should say the reason this is important is while the president in Romania is supposed to be politically neutral, that office has some significant roles to play, especially in foreign policy and defense. Not only, of course, do they appoint the prime minister or they can call a referendum, they are also the commander-in-chief. They lead the Council of National Defense. They can mobilize the armed forces, and they also represent Romania on the international stage. So all of the big summits, etc. If George Simion had won, you would have had a far-right president alongside all of the NATO partners, and someone who has been painted and honestly has made some pretty pro-Russian statements. So I think that's the big reason why there's a big sigh of relief across Europe for the fact that Dan won.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of brings to a close, at least for now, a 6-month saga that had, in some ways roiled transatlantic relations because the incoming Trump administration, was angered by the Romanian courts throwing out the initial elections that happened in December, where another pro-right, pro-Russian candidate had won, and there was claims of social media manipulation and Russian funding. And this, was quite controversial. And there was, I think, a fear in Romania, especially amongst the pro-European parts of Romania, that such a intervention in the election process was going to spur a backlash. See that in the first round. One of the interesting things about this election was the really large turnout of the Romanian diaspora around Europe. Of course, there's an ability for Romanians to live and work elsewhere in Europe, and many voted in this election. The turnout was really strong. Interestingly enough, they tended to vote for the far-right candidate Simion. That was not the case, though, with the dual passport holders in Muldova, where they were really encouraged to vote. And they voted, I think, more than 80% for Dan. And then another interesting tidbit is that a Hungarian community in Romania, which is quite large, they're in the west of Romania, they voted for Dan quite strongly against the far-right candidate, despite Viktor Orban sort of endorsing Simion, saying, vote for him. And this is a population that gets to also vote in the Hungarian elections that have tended to be quite pro-Orban. But I guess if you're a Hungarian minority in Romania, voting for a far-right nationalist candidate that is in some ways quite anti-Hungarian is not all that appealing. Sort of shows some of the challenges of far-right nationalist candidates uniting together to form sort of any kind of coherent outlook and coalition.
And that's probably what drove the vote in Moldova as well, is they were looking at a potential president, or the dual passport holders, I should say. There were no Moldovan citizens voting in the Romanian election, let me be clear. But the one with dual citizenship saw a potential president who was far right, potentially quite pro-Russian. And there's this little piece of Moldova that is still occupied in Transnistria. And if you see someone who is a Romanian nationalist, you're going to be afraid that this president wants to drop Moldova's interests. And Romania has been a very strong voice to support Moldova's interests against Russia for a very long time. Last thing I want to say on Romania, it's interesting as well, is it's a historically pretty anti-Russian country. They have just historical antipathy towards each other, despite during the Soviet times, Romania lived in autarky, and those two leaders did not necessarily get along. And that has stayed even after the fall of Ceausescu and the fall of the Soviet Union. And so seeing a pro-Russian candidate rise like this is still pretty interesting. And I think that tells you that it's not necessarily that part of Simeon that attracted voters, is the deep, deep dysfunction in the political space in Romania, which continues because the government is completely unstable. Now Dan is going to have to appoint a new government, and Romanians just don't trust their political system at all. So the fact that both candidates to some extent were outsiders is what played an important role, and I think also a role in Simeon's gains.
Yeah, but, big sigh of relief in Brussels, and this is not then going to provide sort of another ally to Viktor Orban to block things at the EU level. Not that he was, actually blocking Russia sanctions anyway. He was just threatening to do so. But, the EU now trundles forward. There were also elections in Poland and Portugal. The first round of the Polish elections went, the far right did quite well. The candidate that represents the moderate coalition sort of underperformed. There's going to be another election in 2 weeks. We'll see if it sort of follows the same trend that we see here in Romania. Then there was also an election in Portugal. And there in Portugal, the far right party, I think the big noteworthy thing, the far right party sort of continues its ascendance, and the socialist center-left party did quite poorly after forcing elections to happen, and that sort of seemed to backfire on them.
Completely. It did. They lost several points, and they're now tied in the number of seats with Chega, which is the far-right party in Portugal. So that shows that voters don't necessarily love it when you try to instill more political dysfunction. It's also tricky because the socialist parties were ousted from the government with Costa, who is now at the EU level, because of a scandal around potential corruption and abuse of influence, etc. And they lost control of the government. And then Democratic Alliance, the center-right party, came up for that. And then this government fell also because of the impression of impropriety, because of some consultancy that the prime minister was working in before, but to quite a, I would say, different extent than what the previous scandal was about. So it seems to me like voters saw this as the socialists overplaying their hand because they lost a lot. But Democratic Alliance, the party of the current prime minister, did well. They gained 4 points from the election that they had basically a year ago. They gained 6 seats as well. They're still very far short of what they need for a governing majority, but they had been running a minority government anyway. Mm-hmm. So the winners here are definitely Chega, but also Democratic Alliance, and clear losers is the Socialist Party for overplaying their hand.
So the other big topic that we want to touch on is the UKEU deal or summit that happened over the weekend, and there was sort of white smoke announcement of an agreement. And it's pretty broad-based. There was a deal on farming exports, on fish that, that was causing, all sorts of consternation. There's a defense and security pact has been established between the UK and EU, the details of which are still rather light and thin. And this is true on most of these issues. They're sort of providing a framework, but it will enable the UK to join the EU's PESCO military mobility project and will give the UK access to the new SAFE loan program that the EU has announced that we've talked about the 150 billion loan plan to provide loans to countries to invest in defense. Interestingly, it also sort of, I think, creates progress on youth mobility and Erasmus so that young Brits and Europeans can sort of travel and study in the UK and in Europe. And then I think this is particularly important for me is that the
Which is
past
always the crux of our
yeah, which
analysis
is,
here.
when you travel to Europe and then suddenly there's a huge horde of British tourists like in line to get their passports stamped in like Lisbon or another place. You're like, my God, what has Brexit wrought? As I have to now wait, 20 minutes, half
For
an
what
hour.
used to be the only American line.
Right. It was, America, everybody else. And so apparently the Brits are going to be, and it's up to countries to do this, but moved into the kind of e-gates that are proliferating. And then also importantly, I think on carbon and energy, this sort of brings the UK more in line with the carbon emissions trading scheme. So in carbon pricing so that they'll be aligned. Generally, very good progress. But what I think to just take a step back, what has sort of happened here is that the UK, the Labour government had decided to sort of do, I think, a very broad but limited in scope deal. So not just trying to rejoin the common market. So in some ways, this is quite disappointing to, I think, many in Remain, not as bold as it should be. Yet they're still going to be criticized by the Tories
They already
and
are.
Reform because I think on some of the agriculture and other things that they're going to have to be subjected to, oh my God, the European Court of Justice. And so it rolls back some of Brexit, sets a precedent so that you're going to get the Nigel Farage's, throwing venom at this, but yet doesn't fully attack the calamity that Brexit has been for the UK economically. It doesn't probably provide the kind of broad-based economic benefits that a further alignment with the common market would mean. So, one critique is that you're accepting a lot of the political pain without a lot of the economic gain. And maybe it would have been smarter to just go full hog here. But I think, from what had been reported and sort of the expectations, is all this fighting about fish. This seems more broad based and sort of sets the course, at least for the next 4 years, for a more stable UK-EU relationship.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not that ambitious. It's also a lot of it is up in the air and we're waiting to see the detail. And the devil is in the detail. It's a good symbolic agreement. The announcement that we want to be closer from the UK and from Brussels, we want to be closer together on defense and security, super important at this time. And in the interview that we have after this with Jana Puglierin, we talk about the ambitions across Europe, the quote unquote big leaders, with Merz and Macron and Starmer to really be forward leaning on Ukraine. And that is one way to do this. The trick for the security partnership is that the UK may also need to pay into this loan program. So obviously that's where the backlash is going to be, but seems only fair. The announced reduction in checks for plant and animal products is super important. The UK has lost tons of exports to Europe because of those Brexit border checks. And I think, yes, so Reform UK did quite well in local elections in the UK recently, but not on the backs of Brexit argument, which is what they were able to do before. They did this because the economic situation generally in Britain is not great. And I think a lot of farmers and exporters have seen how bad it's been. So this might actually be of interest to them. And sure, the UK approved a 12-year extension of this fishing agreement, which is huge for European fishermen. And Reform is going to ding them on that. But it's one small giveaway in a much bigger picture. And as you said, Starmer announced very clearly they're not returning to the customs union. They're not returning to free movement. Even if this youth mobility scheme comes into play, which is very up in the air still, then all of this is still very controlled. And I think he can make the argument that it's going to be a constrained agreement. So he can defend it pretty well. Obviously, he's going to get hit on it, but he was going to, regardless of the deal he makes.
I think that, the broader problem for the UK has always been is that the UK wants the economic project of Europe, but really struggles both on the left and on the right with the political project. And the failure or the blind spot in Margaret Thatcher's view of Europe, she pushed for the Single European Act, which then really pushed actually the European economic project forward, was that in order to create a common market, to break down regulatory barriers, to have a one open space is not actually a libertarian enterprise. You need to have a very strong center that then has a court that then can make rulings and breaks down all the protectionist barriers that the French and others put up. So that created actually and helped strengthen Brussels, something that Boris Johnson really saw when he was Brussels correspondent for the Daily Telegraph and was writing about how, oh my God, look at the power that is being generated in Brussels. And so this is going to be the central conundrum for the UK over the next generation. Can it stomach the political side of the EU and therefore integrate more and more economically? Or is it going to be in this kind of halfway house where it pretends it has sovereignty, but has to economically become more integrated?
And I think the extra challenge for the UK in getting this, this vision for Europe is that I think for the last few years, they've also lacked a political vision for the UK. Its constituent countries have started to kind of float apart. Obviously, Scotland has talked about independence for a long time. The tensions that Brexit created for Northern Ireland, it's really hard. London has to first grapple with what it wants to be in its own union, and then how, as that union, it can approach Brussels.
And lastly, what I think the EU realizes is that it doesn't need the UK economically. This isn't like a big concern for them, but it does want the UK militarily. And I think that's where there's a basis of a bargain here that's incentivized the EU to make some reforms of like, okay, we're not going to treat this as an a la carte thing where you can then take what you want of the EU, but we do want you to play this military role and become more militarily integrated with what we're doing at the EU level. So we're going to do that and we'll make some concessions. And I think that's generally a good bargain, and we'll see how things go from here. And with that, I think we'll transition to our interview with Jana Puglierin.
We are thrilled to welcome Jana Puglierin to the Eurofile. Dr. Puglierin is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and head of its Berlin office since January 2020. She also directs ECFR's Reorder project, which explores emerging visions of the global order as well as the interplay between economic might and geopolitical influence. Her work focuses on German and European foreign, security, and defense policy, as well as Germany's role in Europe and transatlantic relations. All very easy topics. Jana, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
So we're recording this on Monday, May 19th. Friedrich Merz has been chancellor for a week and a half, almost 2 weeks. It was a little bit of a rocky start, as we all know. Before he started, had to go through a second vote, but he made it after we all waited for him to arrive for quite a while since the election. How would you rate his performance so far?
So I focus on the aspects that I cover professional, so I talk as an expert and maybe not as a citizen. What I find really positive is that he fully threw himself into European coalition building immediately. He traveled to France and Poland and to Brussels. He's just been to Italy. So he's really, really committed to bringing Germany back to the heart of Europe. He sees Germany as a potentially very strong actor and player, and he wants to be constructive. So he wants to find solutions with his European counterparts. That is very positive. What I find concerning, I would not say negative so far, but concerning is that, first of all, I'm not so sure about the cohesion of the coalition when it comes to foreign security defense policy. And I'm not so sure about the ambition, the level of ambition of Friedrich Merz and whether it's the right one. And I give you a few examples very briefly. So the government had just basically stated that they wanted to be more strategically ambiguous on arms exports and support for Ukraine, specifically to be less transparent and to not let Russia know in advance what our plans were. And the very moment basically that statement was made, the SPD stepped forward and said, but we're not talking about Taurus here. There will no be Taurus with us, with the SPD. That was undermining the whole purpose. And another example is our foreign minister, Johann Wadefuhl, enthusiastically agreed to the 5% kind of NATO commitment that kind of up for discussion for the next NATO summit, whereas our defense minister, Pistorius, was more reluctant and saying, well, let's not talk about percentages, more about NATO capability targets. And he sounded quite differently. And the last example was a comment I read in an interview that Friedrich Merz gave just recently to the FAZ, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, while he was in Italy, where he was asked about European boots on the ground in Ukraine. Well, not now, obviously, but I think the newspaper wanted to hint at the discussions that Macron and Starmer have pushed. And Merz said, and I quote, "There are no decisions, nor are there any discussions about whether we should deploy troops to Ukraine from EU member states or from the European part of NATO. This discussion does not exist, and there is no necessity at the moment." I mean, you can emphasize the at the moment, but this discussion very much is alive and kicking. I've just been to the Latin conference in Tallinn 3 days, where this was very much a topic. And this concerns me because I'm just wondering whether, all these strong and tough announcements that we heard from the candidate for Chancellor Merz during the election campaign will now kind of fade away and turn into something that resembles more dust and ambiguity.
I want to ask you about the transatlantic aspect of the relationship. Merz, when he won the election and was set to become chancellor, you all have this amazing tradition of then having this roundtable exercise with all the chancellor candidates. And Merz was incredibly sober. I mean, it seemed like this is, probably one of the greatest nights of his life. He's going to become the chancellor of Germany. And yet he basically is talking about the end of the transatlantic relationship and how Europe is on its own and how Germany has to lead. Has there been a shift in that tenor? I think the 5% seems like obviously a nod to Trump. I don't know how real it will be. I'm curious if you think that's going to be quite real. But it seems like things are sort of better when it comes to transatlantic engagement. How would you describe Merz on the transatlantic relationship? Is he assuming it's over? Is he just going to play nice because why stoke tension? Or how do you kind of see this playing out in Berlin?
So maybe we talk a bit about Merz's personal background. So he's a dyed-in-the-wool transatlanticist. He has chaired the prestigious Atlantikbrücke. He has worked in a transatlantic economic context. He really believes in the transatlantic relationship. He's a big fan of the United States of America, and he's very Anglophile in everything he does. So during the election campaign, he was still quite optimistic and positive. He was even talking about the possibility to do trade deals with the Trump administration, potentially. And then we had these I think it were 10 days of horror from a European perspective. We had Peter Hegseth over in Brussels. That was the overture. Then we had the Vance speech in Munich. And then we had this horrible meeting in the White House between President Zelensky and President Trump, where Zelensky was thrown out of the White House. And I think what Friedrich Merz said shortly after he was elected was very much informed by what we had just seen. There was big insecurity in Germany where Trump was headed, especially when it came to Ukraine. But also, and this is a very important point, this came in quite handy for Merz because Merz had, throughout the election campaign, promised to keep the debt brake in place and to not take on more debt. And he was advocating harsh cuts in order to finance Germany's new ambitious plans. And then after the election, when he wanted to form a coalition with the SPD, he made a U-turn on this, and the coalition agreed on this new big financial package financed with debt. So he basically broke his campaign promise on day one, and the transatlantic relationship gave him a bit of a cover in order to do this, because he could basically point to a situation of emergency that we could not have foreseen. And he used this also to explain his U-turn. But then a couple of weeks later, when they presented the coalition agreement, the language on the transatlantic relationship was quite normal again, quite business as usual. Yes, Europe needs to do more, but kind of nothing to see here, please, please walk away. And now I think the government has embraced the strategy of trying to work with the Trump administration as much as possible and to signal a constructive approach from Berlin, because basically we don't want to be the ones walking away and making it impossible to work together. We want to signal we are ready. And there is, I think, still hope, and especially after these meetings in the Vatican and this kind of fantastic photo with the 5 European heads of state and government, and kind of the phone on the table and Macron on the other end of the line, and this agreement on Ukraine and sanctions. I think there is, and maybe this is premature and too optimistic, but there is new optimism also in Berlin that this can be more constructive than one thought.
Let me then pivot to Europe and Merz's approach to Europe, because in some ways you could view how ambitious Europeans get at the European level dependent on the state of transatlantic relations. the worse transatlantic relations get, the more ambitious Europeans will be to take action, and vice versa. Merz has demonstrated and shown and talked a lot about wanting to play a stronger leadership role in Europe. The question I have is that I'm now sort of deeply concerned about Germany's position in Europe, just sort of more structurally, that when I think about the European project having advanced, I mean, it advanced sort of in the beginning in the 1940s and 50s because Germany was on its knees. This was a way of rehabilitating Germany. After 1989, it was a way Europe advanced, the common currency, European Union enlargement. That was a way of unifying Germany. But then in the Merkel period, it didn't seem like Germany had any vision for what it really wanted from Europe. And I sort of struggled to see what vision Merz has for Europe. You see that from France, what it wants the European Union to do, what it wants it to become. And I sort of struggle, what does Merz want from Europe? What does he want Europe to become? And maybe it's a too conceptual question, but is there a vision there? Or is it just simply putting Germany as more of a problem solver again, perhaps back to the Merkel era, as opposed to Scholz just sort of not really taking a strong interest in trying to lead Europe? A big wind-up conceptual question, but where is this going? And do you expect sort of breakthroughs on big European efforts?
A very good question, actually. Maybe let's go back to Merz's biography again, because I think he is a committed European. He started his career in the European Parliament. He is, in a sense, Helmut Kohl's heir, or more Wolfgang Schäuble's heir. Wolfgang Schäuble was our very famous finance minister and also a committed European, someone who deeply believed in the German-French cooperation and motor. And Merz is, in that sense, a very old-school German European, always emphasizing the need to work closely with France. He also emphasizes Poland frequently, mentions the UK. But that also, I think, gives you some idea of how he sees Europe, or how he sees the way forward in Europe. So I think he's a very foreign policy concentrated chancellor. You know, there is a remark that he recently made while he was traveling. I think it was during the EPC, the European Political Committee. And he said that he basically feels like a fish in the water in this environment. He very much feels to belong there. But he, I think, wants to move Europe forward through coalitions of the willing and through, flexible alliances within the EU and even outside the EU. He always mentions the UK. We see now that there is progress between the EU and the UK there as well. So he will not focus so much on building European institutions, strengthening European institutions, deepening integration, handing over more competencies to Brussels. Germany has been already under Chancellor Scholz very reluctant when it comes to, the new defense initiatives and the strengthened role of the Commission. Germany has been hesitant to support some of it because there was always the perception that the Commission overstates its mandate and is basically grabbing too much power. So I would not expect Germany to be a leader on deeper integration. On the EU level, Merz very much focuses on competitiveness, wants to cut red tape, and I think sees the EU as a useful tool, but I think that is not his focus. His focus is to find solutions with France, Poland, the UK on the big foreign policy questions. And if that is a vision, that's, I think, the closest to a vision that we'll see.
It's interesting that you mention it this way. It sounds to me like what you're saying is he has some idea of what he wants to see happen on the European level, mostly for Ukraine and then with the relationship with the United States. But everything else continues to be driven through the domestic lens. And that's how he sees it. That's how, honestly, most chancellors have seen it, which is fine. They are elected by a national public, but there's so many big conversations happening at the European level. I think some observers and some other leaders in Europe might continue to feel a bit of frustration towards another chancellor who might want to prioritize, domestic German interests. But on that, I want to take us a little bit more domestic, because you mentioned he's a foreign policy chancellor, but earlier you also talked about you have some concerns or questions about his level of ambition. He's obviously made some grand pronouncements around how he wants the federal government to invest in the armed forces, for example. There's a lot that needs to happen at the domestic level in Germany as well to revive the economy, among others. I'm curious for your thoughts on how you interpret or how you read the tea leaves. First, on the coalition government, you talked about there's some concerns around cohesion there, but even just the allocation of ministries was pretty interesting. Looking from afar, the fact that, I mean, for the defense minister, the continuity is important, but finance ministry, the justice ministry going to SPD, those are pretty interesting moves. I'm curious how you interpret that from the perspective of domestic policies and domestic priorities for the coalition, and would also be curious for your thoughts specifically on the issue of migration, which the SPD and CDU might approach slightly differently as well.
Well, this is a lot, but let me start. So, what I think you'll see when it comes to the allocation of ministries is that the CDU really aims for a strong position in foreign and security policy. And I think this is really promising because the Auswärtiges Amt, the Foreign Office, is for the first time in ages and decades in the hands of the CDU. And the Chancellery and the Foreign Ministry basically have the same party color, as we say it in Germany. So this speaks for a more joined up foreign policy, more cohesion, because there is this trend in Germany that predates Merz, goes back to at least Merkel, even prior to that, that the chancellor really is the dominating figure when it comes to defining the big lines of Germany's foreign policy, especially transatlantic relations, relationship with China, with Russia. So Merz will be very ambitious here, and the foreign ministry will, I think, be somewhat reduced to the role of being the enabler of the strategic decisions that Merz has made in the chancellery. The defense minister is interesting because he comes from the SPD, so the coalition partner, but Pistorius, at least during his first term, was much closer basically to Merz's foreign policy worldview than to Olaf Scholz's foreign policy worldview. So I think there really will be some joined up foreign security and defense policy. At least that gives me optimism. The finance ministry is an interesting thing because, so traditionally, when you look back at Germany's history, the smaller coalition partner always picked the foreign office as the most prestigious ministry, and basically the vice chancellor, which comes from the smaller coalition party, was always the foreign minister. That already changed under Olaf Scholz, actually. We've seen it now again with Lars Klingbeil, and I think this just points to the fact that the foreign office has become increasingly irrelevant. I mean, it's still relevant, but it's less important. But the finance ministry gives you real power. And Lars Klingbeil now has the possibility also to shape EU policy quite a bit, because the finance minister always plays a tremendous role here. And given all that new money that we are going to spend on infrastructure, but also on security and defense, there is no decision that can be made without him. So I think the SPD has played this really well. We have 17 ministries in total. The SPD got 7, but the worst election result in their history. So they really did a good job in negotiating. But I think so far, I think the distribution of work is actually constructive and is not paving the way for more infighting. But we have to see. On migration, and that is for me a very important point, you clearly see the tension that you mentioned in your question in the very beginning. So there is the EU Merz, the Friedrich Merz, who really wants to strengthen the European Union and always emphasizes that Germany needs to be more constructive. There should be less of a German vote. There should be Germany as a powerful leader. But when it comes to migration, Friedrich Merz very early took a decision that he announced already during the election campaign, together with the new Minister of the Interior, comes from the CSU, about sending people back at Germany's borders, even if they mention the word asylum. And you can do that according to German law, but you have a problem with EU law because the very dysfunctional, but still kind of legally applicable Dublin system actually doesn't allow for this. So even if there is an asylum seeker who comes from a safe neighboring country, when he comes to the German border and says that he seeks asylum, we need to take him in theoretically and first investigate where does he come from, where was he registered as a refugee for the first time. And we have now used a clause in the treaty on the way the EU works that you can activate in special circumstances once you can no longer guarantee basically your domestic security, once the order is basically disturbed, and you need to take extraordinary measures to stabilize the country. And see Article 72 of the way the EU works. And the Merz government has activated this clause, and our neighbors are not really happy to see this. So the Poles have already raised concern and frustration. The Swiss weren't super happy about this. And it will also be very contested with EU courts, because you cannot make the claim that there is such an extraordinary emergency situation in Germany right now when it comes to migration. I think he wanted to deliver on his campaign promise, Friedrich Merz. He wanted to really show that he's ready to toughen Germany's migration system, but he's doing this at the expense of EU law and other European countries. And Germany was always critical with other countries like Hungary and Poland when they prioritized their national law over EU law. And we were the first to say that this was against the European idea and was harming the European Union. And now we do it ourselves. I mean, we have done it before, but I think this is a very prominent case.
Yeah, and it's just the precedent that it sets, and then, the potential unraveling of free and open movement inside the EU. Certainly don't want to see that happen. There's something very performative, I think, of a new chancellor coming in and demonstrating quite visibly that he's cracking down on illegal migration. Well, I do think that having the foreign minister be of the same party of the chancellor is something that I think it just makes sense. And it was always quite confusing to me that Germany would, tended to not have that set up, or didn't have that set up, and that you would not sure if you were talking to the foreign minister, if they were actually speaking on behalf of the German government. I think we saw that very clearly in the last administration. Maybe one final question is, how do you see Merz's approach toward China or the rest of the world? Sort of, this is an open canvas. Are there other aspects of how Germany's going to operate in the world that we should be paying attention to? The thing that comes to mind in particular is, how is Germany going to approach China? Anything that we should be looking out for here in Washington for how this German government's going to operate in the world?
In China, I think it's too easy to say what the direction will be. Friedrich Merz has been very critical with China in his speeches, in his foreign policy speeches, but also in general. The CDU, they have written their own China strategy a couple of years ago. That was actually, I think, quite good, but also quite hawkish. But at the same time, the chancellor faces an economic situation in Germany that is really not promising. So we are in a recession now for the third year in a row. Business is complaining about too much bureaucracy and too little incentives for innovation. There is a lack of competitiveness. And I don't know how much Merz will basically be constrained also by the economic situation. That was the problem also with the previous government. There was a huge tension between the Green foreign minister and the SPD chancellor on China. The Green foreign minister wanted to go much further, be much more restrictive, criticizing Scholz a lot. But Scholz, tried to walk this thin line and always said, we need to work with China. And informally, I've heard kind of from people in the SPD, well, we've just basically lost Russia as the provider of cheap energy that has been weakening the German economy tremendously. We cannot afford to just cut voluntarily another leg of our economy. I think it's a bit short-sighted as an argument, because in the long run, we have our relationship with China, I think economically is not sustainable, but it's always a question of time frame. So what is more important to you? So I think it's too early to say. We'll see what he does vis-a-vis China. Another priority of the old government was to strengthen Germany's relationships with the Global South, new partnerships with other partners that we had not that extensively worked with before. And I'm very curious to learn whether this new government follows kind of the same approach. They are less vocal about this, about the necessity to work with, Brazil or India. But I think they understand that Germany in this period, and given the global situation, given the necessity to de-risk, needs these new partnerships. But so far, that has been less of a focus.
Jana, it has been a pleasure to have you. Thanks so much for joining the Eurofile.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.